Welcome everyone. And so the two kind of topics that I was thinking of doing today. So first off, um, I guess I personally, honestly, have never really been that interested in family history. It's just never been something that's spoke to me. I mostly, from what I could tell of my family, it was mostly sort of creepy and shameful, sort of Southern Gothic kind of stuff. So I just wanted to avoid it for the most part. And but Eric is my fiance is super interested in history and in families and in archives and all of that stuff, and he just deep dived into this and actually found some stuff that was really interesting. So I'm very grateful to that for that. And pretty much everything I'll be sharing today is based on his research. So I should just give credit where it is due. This is not my own historical research, but rather his. Um, and so it actually turned out he found out my ancestor, the sort of first Fuller in America, was a very influential early Quaker in America in Maryland. And that there's like a letter to George Fox about with him and stuff. So I guess I was gonna just first off use sort of the little first part of the forum just to share a little bit about that. And it also just gets into some of the complicated history of Quakers in the American colonies in the early, very early sort of 1650s, 1660s kind of time. And then I sort of gonna just, I'm hoping you guys will also have some stories to share probably a little bit later in the forum, just because I honestly have no idea. I mean, I think it's kind of cool and interesting, but I have no idea what it has to do with me. Really, this fact about my sort of Quaker, way back Quaker ancestry, if anything. And just, I'm curious what, whether your family histories, the spiritual, like, whether that has any bearing on your spiritual life or on how you think about yourself in Quakerism. And I'd just be curious to hear what other people make of that part of their knowledge about themselves and their ancestors. So anyway, I guess maybe I'll start off just, by telling you guys a little bit more about Captain William Fuller. There's the family book, Captain William Fuller and His Descendants, is, I guess, some of my relatives are very into this. The So I guess he arrived in the 1650s in Virginia. And at the time, Maryland was kind of part of Virginia. It had just sort of been given initial right to establish its own colony. Lord Baltimore went there to establish a colony mostly for Catholics who were being persecuted in England at the time. And there was sort of a smaller group of Catholics who settled in the Maryland area. Though I guess I learned that later, Virginia was not actually very happy about this. They still sort of thought that this should be part of Virginia. So some of the later conflicts had to do with that. But in addition to being a Catholic colony, which is mostly what I'd heard about and remembered from my, American history back in elementary school, it turned out there was actually a pretty large Puritan colony in Maryland as well. They established it, I think it was near where Annapolis is now. It was called Providence, Maryland, and a fairly large number of Puritans settled there, one of whom was my ancestor. And he came to become a fairly prominent member of the community. He was in particular very involved with negotiations with the Susquehanna Indian tribe, which was an Iroquois nation that was present there. So there was a lot of conflict and negotiation, particularly over this island, Isle of Kent, which is on the sort of eastern shore of Maryland. And he sort of negotiated some sort of land being handed over from the Susquehanna. But it's strange. This is where the history gets really strange. So he's, in this sense, reading that, of course, you hear immediately that brings to mind just the whole history of Native peoples being sort of forced or tricked or somehow into these treaties and giving up large chunks of land to European settlers. But this is where it gets sort of mysterious, is the Susquehanna were, I guess, very fond of William Fuller to the extent that when he had to flee the colony eventually, they were unwilling to deal with other people. and they were, I guess, also to some extent allies. The Susquehanna war pretty continuously with the other tribes in the area. They were Iroquois speaking. The other tribes were mostly Algonquins in the area, and there was, yeah, just a great deal of conflict between them. I guess I probably won't be talking about them too much later, but the Susquehanna eventually do sort of end up, most of them, I think shortly thereafter, died of diseases that came over. So that sort of, they ended up sort of dissipating as a tribe in the end. So getting back to the story. So the Puritan colony there, when the Civil War in England starts, and during the sort of Commonwealth period, Lord Baltimore, the Commonwealth decides he's no longer the ruler of Maryland. And so the Puritans sort of decide, okay, we are sort of now the rightful government here. The Catholics or Lord Baltimore does not think this is good, and so he sends an army, a force over to Providence, to the Puritan colony, to take away their guns and to sort of disarm them so that they won't actually be able to pose a threat to him. And so this leads to the Battle of Severe, where William Fuller leads the Puritan force, and they end up beating Lord Baltimore's army at that point, and I guess taking several captives, or most of the other Maryland force captive. They end up executing 4 of the prisoners, which ultimately will turn out to be a crucial thing a little bit later on. Because once Charles is restored and the monarchy is restored, Lord Baltimore is once again in charge of Maryland and is out for vengeance. And so he then issues warrants of arrest for Captain William Fuller, who has to flee to England at that time. Sorry, this story is all out of order. I'm still trying to get it all together in my head. In the meantime, this Elizabeth Harris shows up in Maryland. She is one of the early Quaker missionaries to arrive in the New World. She's a little bit less well known than, I think it was Anne Fisher, you correct me if I'm wrong. There were a couple who ended up, Mary Dyer, the ones who ended up in New England were sort of pretty quickly sort of shut confined and not allowed to preach there. But Elizabeth Harris was much more able to move around in Maryland and in the Chesapeake Bay area. And so she actually made quite a number of converts in Maryland, one of whom was Captain William Fuller, who becomes quite a prominent Quaker, and along with a number of the other sort of important figures in the sort of higher, what had been sort of the Puritan establishment there. So yeah, so they're Quakers, and that's unfortunate. So that happens, and then he gets kicked out of Maryland because they're after him and they're going to try to arrest him. So he goes back to England, at which point he is then imprisoned for being a Quaker there, because that is, I guess, what's happening in England. So he's in jail.
Bad time for a Quaker to go to England, you know?
Yeah, I guess there's no really place to go. I think he also, yeah, so he's there for a while, and he's probably in jail with a bunch of other Quakers there, and then he ends up in Jamaica and Barbados, maybe Barbados for a while. This records are a little spotty, but I guess there were actually quite a lot of Quakers in Jamaica and Barbados. That these were sort of major areas of sort of Quaker stopping off there. Unfortunately, his family was still in Maryland, so he'd had to leave, and they were still in Maryland. So he had to come and get them out of Maryland, and then they ended up in South Carolina, which is where my family, most of the subsequent history of the Fullers in the Americas is in South Carolina. Yeah, I guess there he also becomes a pretty prominent member of the community. The record stopped mentioning Quakerism as much. I imagine, I think it doesn't say anything to the contrary, so I think he still was a friend at that time. He was very involved there also with relations with the Native American populations. In this case, it was sort of the conflict with the Westo Indians in South Carolina. So the Westo were another Iroquois-speaking nation. I guess his relation with them was because the Carolina colony was allied with other tribes, and the Westo were attacking the other tribes, capturing slaves, and then selling slaves to plantations in South Carolina. And so Captain William Fuller, his job was he was having to go around to the plantations and uh, get the Native Americans who had been enslaved by the Westo and liberating them, because that was the relationship with these other tribes. Again, yeah, it's this very complicated relationship with the Native American tribes that at the one hand, the conflict between, eventually the Westo are then allied with the Carolinas and then eventually destroyed by the Carolinas colony. So it's this sort of constant dance back and forth of friendship, alliance, fighting with other tribes, the other tribes being enslaved, them being, yeah, so it's like slavery and freedom and all these sort of things, they're just, I mean, ultimately it does conform to the narrative of European colonists destroying and decimating native communities in the long run. But when you sort of zoom into it, it just gets really messy and complicated. And many of the tribes were also involved in slavery and genocide of each other. And it was just a sort of horrible big mess at the time, I guess I get the impression. But after that time, I'm not really sure what happens to Quakerism in the family. There really isn't any reference to it later on. I'm not sure whether Captain William Fuller was convinced, but his family, who were left in Maryland for a while, were not. Later on, there's certainly, I don't see any other references to Quakerism in sort of the later Fuller family, or at least, or, well, I should say I haven't seen it. Eric hasn't seen it. I haven't really been looking at it enough to know whether there was much, but he hasn't found anything there either. And sort of an interesting history, what happened in Maryland with the Friends, who we had to flee, that there actually was quite a prominent Quaker community in Maryland for a while. And to the point where in that intermediate stage, before he was forced to flee and when he was still sort of a prominent Quaker in Maryland, there actually was thought that maybe that would be where the Quaker colony in America would be. That they would send the Quakers to Maryland just because there already was a strong presence there and they were in fairly strong political position in that colony. But of course, he then is forced to flee. And then after the Restoration, just what happens in Maryland, the monarchy, the Church of England is established in Maryland, at which point Catholics and Quakers who refused to take oaths and refused to sort of join that church end up being kind of marginalized and persecuted. And then sort of Quakerism, partially as a reaction to that persecution, sort of turns towards quietism and becomes much more internally focused. The Quakers then sort of become sort of a smaller, still fairly wealthy and prominent community, but not expansive, not particularly dynamic within Maryland for quite a while, until kind of this period when abolition becomes much more of a pressing issue. At which point the Maryland Quakers, many of them do, so either they are very strongly in their testimony of abolition. It's still a plantation economy in that area. And so either people leave the Quaker community to continue to own slaves and be part of the plantation economy, or a number of Friends really do liberate, set free their slaves, and at which point though they really can't survive in that area anymore because they don't really have any way of being part of the economic life of Maryland. And so a lot of them end up going west to Ohio and being part of the Ohio yearly meeting there. But basically Quakerism in that area of Maryland ends up going away at that time because it really, there's no more sort of viable community. Yeah, anyway, so that was sort of a long and winding story that I don't think I told with particular coherence, but hopefully that makes some amount of sense, at least as much sense as it makes to me. But I might share at this point the letter to George Fox that mentions my ancestor in it and that contains some of these complexities in it. Let me see, I'm going to screen share real quick.
Could I work in a quick question?
Oh yeah, go for it. Sorry, I've been rambling on. Yes, please, sir.
What was the year that Captain Fuller had to leave? So I'm looking, the Penn colony was founded in 1681. So I'm wondering if this was before the founding of the colony. That was, of course, under Charles II. But see, Charles II had a bit more warmth toward friends than the Parliament, which was all these cavaliers who were trying to get vengeance for the Civil War, basically. So that's well, I was surprised when they fled to England. That was fleeing into the lion's mouth, I would think.
Let's see. Oh, so I guess by this point, so it was he fled in. Well, the governor issued the arrest decree in 1661, by
Oh,
which point he'd already,
this was
yeah.
about 20 years before the Penn colony. See, I was wondering why he didn't just go to Pennsylvania, but
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
there wasn't one.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions about this sort of this story before moving on to looking at this letter?
Well, it is interesting to me that that Quakerism in Maryland was complex because slavery in Maryland was very complex. It was a complex issue there. So that is interesting to find the parallel.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that's a big reason why I've kind of, and perhaps this is not a good reaction to this, but why I haven't been super excited about family history for the most part, because when they did go to South Carolina, they did become plantation owners. And that's most of my family's history in America is in South Carolina in the plantations. Oh yeah, and Melissa.
I was just wondering, James, how you felt when you learned that you had such a long and storied history in Quakerism.
Kind of happy and surprised. They're like, oh wow, that's really cool. I wonder if there's some like little Quaker gene that like pops up every 400 years or so in the family. But I don't. Yeah, I just I'm still not sure what to feel about it. Honestly, that's kind of why I'm doing this forum. Is so hopefully you guys will help me know what to feel about this in the end. Yeah.
Well, this is all very fascinating information, and I'm wondering about Chip's comment that slavery was. I don't want to get us off on a tangent. That slavery was particularly complex in Maryland. I'm just wondering what was meant by that.
But I think down, especially down towards the eastern shore. I mean, that was really a plantation, like James is saying. That was a plantation economy. I mean, it was very deep south, the eastern part of Maryland. It was, along with several others. It was Delaware. They were slave states. They certainly less population, not 50% of the population like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, but there was a large portion of Maryland, or I say a large portion, especially the Eastern Shore area, was based on a slave economy. But yet when it came to the Civil War, I mean, they elected as a state to move that direction. So I just think it was complex, probably from both a spiritual, economic, and how we envisioned each other at that particular time.
James, I just wanted to ask you if you knew when your ancestors set up plantations in South Carolina. Were they growing rice?
Yes. They were rice, yeah, rice plantation.
That's what I suspected. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah, are you saying something or?
Me? I do have something to say, but I didn't
Sure.
know what the proper time was. My father has been obsessed with genealogy since I was a child. And I was dragged to all these cemeteries and county courthouses as a child during vacation. Other people were going to Disney World and we were going to like the cemeteries. And I think this issue about how much importance we put on our ancestors is a really interesting question. It's like, what is this yearning? What is this yearning to know our roots? Is it like tribalism? Is that healthy? I have to admit that I got caught with the so-called genealogy bug when I was in my mid-30s. My father had already done my mother's and my father's families. So I did my husband's family because my mother said my daughter needed to know her roots, and she only was going to have the one side. She wasn't going to have the swearer side if I didn't do something about it. And so I got hooked. And for me, it was like being a detective, because obviously I'm not related to any of the swearers, right? I married into the family. So it was all about being a detective, and I just really got hooked. And I don't want to go into a long harangue about it, but I do think this question about whether it's healthy or spiritually good to dwell on our ancestors, I don't know how to answer that question, but I do think it's an essential question, and it's an essential question in my life because, you know, I've had this grandfather on my mother's side who was sort of banished from the family when she was 4. He died before I was born, and I recently unearthed all this information about him, and some of it's really disturbing, and I'm just trying to process it right now. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there, and other people can comment or whatever.
My mother had a very interesting take on what Sarah's talking about. She kind of, I wouldn't say actively kept from us as kids certain facts about the family, history. But finally, when we were all adults, this was just maybe 20, 25 years ago, which sounds like a long time, but we were, all in our 40s and 50s. We were all home, and she revealed what for her was not a proud family secret of her side of the family, which was that they were on the Mayflower and were the founders of Plymouth Colony, some of them, and that had remained prominent in New England, and that she and her mother had been invited and rejected to become daughters of the American Revolution. So it was kind of like, I'm not sure what her attitude toward the Puritans and all that in Massachusetts was, but she felt that she felt apparently that it wasn't healthy for us kids to know that when we were kids. And so she, and since, and then I have a cousin who went way overboard on this. And so now I know everybody for the last 13 generations back into England, and who got on the Mayflower and all that. But I thought that was kind of an interesting, my mother was one of those people. She didn't like people claiming privilege or rights of birth and things like that. So that kind of falls along with that. But yeah, I find it very fascinating that I had ancestors like that. And there are some not very savory things about them, but we'll go into that some other time.
Yeah, I guess it all has to do with your intention. If you're doing all this genealogy because you want to prove that you came over on the Mayflower and thus are better than other people, it's a really destructive thing. But if it's, I think the appeal is simply your handle on history, figuring out where, you came from as a matter of your family gives you a start on understanding a little bit and having a little more personal connection with the past. And that's a pretty positive thing, I think.
I'd like to hear that letter, and then maybe we could continue the general discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Screen share. Oh, and here's the letter. All right. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
All right. Let's see. I don't know. Would someone like to go ahead and read some of this? It's in sort of old spelling, so just a warning.
I'll give it a shot here.
Oh, thank you, Chip. All right.
So this is Josiah Cole to George Fox, Maryland, and it gives the year there. Dear George, whom my soul loveth, and whom I honor in the Lord, and who in ye life of truth art, dear and precious to me, in which according to my measure, which I have received, do I dearly salute and embrace thee, dear George. As concerning passages here, all is quiet, as ye in relating to truth and meetings are precious, and the Lord manifest his precious presence and love among us in our assembly, and persecution doth not yet appear in this province of Maryland, but the spirit thereof is chained down for a season, that the babes may renew their strength. For at my first coming amongst friends here, a great weakness was over many, and great confusion and distraction was amongst them, the people. So some sense or feeling of life was even lost among many, chiefly occasioned by their judging on another. Let's see. Where am I here? I'm sorry. Chiefly among them judging on another, for some run out into words without life, and others judged rashly with a fiery spirit, and them that sought to rule amongst them was lifted up in pride, and many who were simple-hearted could not bow to that spirit, so that they were much in confusion, and little unity felt with them. But now these things are well over, and life ariseth over it all. And truly it is the rich love of the Lord to them to stay the hand of persecution for a season, for a greater time of weakness was not amongst them, since they knew the truth. I have been amongst them about 10 weeks, and have at present well nigh cleared myself in this province, and I am upon passing down into Virginia to visit the remnant that is there, and to sound forth God's mighty day among the heathen. And as a way is made, I shall pass to Barbados, and from thence to New England, for so it is upon me. Dear George, as concerning friends buying a piece of land in the Susquehanna Indians, I have spoken of it to them, and told them what thou said concerning. Their answer was, and that there is no land that is habitable or fit for situation beyond Baltimore's Liberty, till they come to or near the Susquehanna's fort. And besides William Fuller, who was the chief man among friends with the Indians, by reason he was late governor among the English, he is withdrawn at present, for these are of them who are in present authority, that seeks his life with much greediness for some old matter that they had against him, and their envy is stirred up afresh by reason he had a hand in the changing of government last year, when they took away the authority from Baltimore, which hath much stirred up against their rage against them, so that without him there can little be done at present with the Indians. And besides, these Indians are at war with another nation of Indians, who are very numerous, and it is doubted by some that in a little space they will be so destroyed they will not be a people. For themselves have spoken to the English already, that if their men are killed, they will receive their wives and children, and give them food for their labor. And one of them said further, that if they were beaten, which they never was yet, because they never undertook a bad cause, then they would come against their children, the English, and if they would not receive them as men, they should receive them as slaves, so that there is nothing like to be done at the present. But if it may be, it's like it will be seen next summer. So, dear George, all things amongst friends is at present pretty well, and some here is aided since my coming, so having no more present, but to desire thy prayers for me, I remain thine in truth, Josiah Cole.
Thank you for reading that, Chip. It's tricky. Maybe I'll stop screen sharing now. Um, yeah, gosh. I found that at first I wasn't quite clear on the story, so I was very baffled by that document. It's just got a lot of so I think what he was referring to was the person searching for him in greediness was Lord Baltimore, because of the Battle of Severe, as well as the threat to the authority of him. So that was the proclamation of the governor for William Fuller's arrest. And then, yeah, I guess the Susquehanna were, a war with the more Algonquin tribes there. And so, but yeah, that whole sort of story then of them wanting to negotiate with Fuller, but then also being willing to say, if our tribe is beaten, then we'll come amongst you and labor for food, or even enter into slavery. That's, yeah, just a very strange, sort of disturbing thing, I find. And the letter finishes in a strange way, and it says, so basically everything is well with us, after saying all this stuff. It's just like a really weird end to the letter. I guess all things are relative. Back in the 1660s, maybe that was well. So I don't know. Gosh, I don't know. Does anybody have any further thoughts or questions or illumination in terms of what this letter means or what to make of this?
I, James, I think it's a good example of, like you said, when we learn history in school, or when we read history, or when we search on the internet, we get this 30,000-foot overview of what is going on in that period. And I think what you've done is like you say, you've zoomed into a specific period of time and a specific group of people that are related to you. And I think what that does is it takes that history that we learned at 30,000 feet, and it makes it more real. It makes it more understandable in a way, because you're talking about people that are experiencing that history. So I think that letter to me is very interesting in that regard. It's a clip of people's thought at that particular time in that particular situation. So I thought it was pretty neat. It was hard to understand, but it was pretty neat.
I just want to say that it is so rare to have a document like that of that age. Having done research myself for many years, I mean, I came across a document that was written in 1804, the original, and I was so overjoyed to have found this, because I thought 1804 was really early. So anyway, this is just incredible that you have this access to this document.
Eric wrote to the Friends Archive in England, where they have this letter. I guess they still have the original, like, handwritten letter there, just for an image, but they were out because of the coronavirus, so they weren't able to go in and take a photograph of that for him. So this isn't a volume of correspondence that was published in the 30s, I think, was where this letter is.
I'm sure you said before, but I missed it. What was the date of the letter?
Oh, I think it was 16. I'll just look real quick.
1660.
1660. Yeah, that sounds right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's right at the beginning of the Restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also very soon after George Fox traveled in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So it must have been kind of a follow-up to that. So I believe he traveled before that, not after that. Maybe he traveled after that. I'm not sure of the date. It may have been 1665 by the time he traveled. So then he would have been following up on all this news.
So the latter part of the 1650s were the big expansion of Quakers in England. And then the Restoration came along, and the worst of the repression happened. And I'm so, all this is happening in England, all this other stuff is happening in the New World, and one wonders how long it takes the waves of politics and history to hit the other shore.
No, that's very true. Yeah, a lot of it's like them waiting to hear who's in charge in England, and then who is in charge in Maryland. They just don't know what's going on. Yeah.
That strikes me as something that we are so accustomed to instantaneous awareness around the globe, and the fact that people make a trip in their lifetime to the New World or to Barbados, those took weeks and months to get, just to take the trip and to get the correspondence. And so it must have been an extremely different mindset about time and impact of events. So that's just fascinating to think about too.
And you settle your affairs before you leave because you're never sure of getting back. I remember that in Woolman's journal, before he goes to England, he gets everything straight because he doesn't know if it's going to die en route.
I sort of secretly wonder if part of that sort of settling of affairs is why the Quakerism didn't last in the family. If when he went to England and was imprisoned, I think his family stayed in Maryland there. So I can imagine and I think his kids were maybe also adult by that time, that they would have been rather unhappy about that, and maybe not too fond of this sort of new convincement of his, I wonder.
I was interested that the route to New England was through Barbados. Was Barbados a travel hub?
Because of the trade in sugar and
slaves, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's a triangular trade stuff.
Yes, triangular trade stuff. But it's interesting that you'd have to go by land, I guess, from the south to New England, and it was easier to take a boat, I guess, once you were that far south. It's interesting for us to think about because it doesn't seem direct geographically, does it?
Also, just an interesting thing about Barbados, some of the we think of the sort of slave trade just going sort of from Africa, Barbados, and then to the south. I guess in the dissolution of the Westo tribes, I was looking up what happened to them. But when they were eventually conquered, a lot of them were enslaved and sent to Barbados. So that was people being moved there as well. Yeah, gosh, so I guess I'm just curious to ask people, I mean, I know for so many religious traditions in the world, ancestors are crucial, like really powerful and important part of people's spiritual lives. I guess, the Gospel of Matthew, starting with this long genealogy that traces Jesus back to Abraham and all the generations before, that was clearly very important to them, that sort of genealogy and ancestry and history. I think certainly, I guess what I know of sort of Jewish traditions, that sort of connection via sort of lineage is very important to many people. I know sort of a lot of other traditional religions, sort of Chinese traditional religion, you have a strong sort of element of ancestor veneration. Yeah, I'm just wondering that's not something that I sense at all in Quakerism. Well, sort of. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's not something I think is necessarily evil. It seems to play a valuable role in so many people's lives, their relationship to their ancestors. It's not something I want to blanketly condemn as sort of exclusionary and idolatrous or whatever you would want to say. But at the same time, I'm not sure what to make of it myself. Yeah, and I'm just curious what all of you guys make of your ancestors and how they might relate to.
It seems to me it's all about culture. It's about containing a certain lifestyle and values and practices. And so the more you can tie it back generation by generation, linking together, it's a way of preserving the culture, whether it's Jewish or other groups that have been, especially those who've been persecuted, maybe trying hold tighter to their traditions and their image, their sense of self. It can have a mixed outcome, though. I mean, like growing up, I always had the story told that my great grandfather was the last man out of the Alamo and the first mayor of San Antonio, and that connection to Texas and all of that. Except that as I found out more about why the war that Texans were holding against Mexico was about slavery, then that kind of, that twist of what we were fighting for back in those days becomes more difficult to identify with. But I think it has to do with status, with connection, with the history of our family lives. That's why it seems to have such power. We have a place in the world.
Well, it's so ambiguous. We're white Southerners. I mean, I love your term, Southern Gothic. I mean, my family has a lot of Southern Gothic in it, and and then when we think about that, we think, do we assume the guilt of everything that they did? Oh my God, and it's a tough question to answer.
Well, I had always thought that the reverence for ancestors came from the fact that we're one of the few species that have grandparents alive at the same time as the grandchildren's, and that in order for that to occur, there had to be some reverence or value of the grandparents. And of course, grandparents do have value in that they have knowledge that they can pass on to the grandchildren. But somehow that appreciation for the grandparents had to occur simultaneously with the value of the grandparents, and by extension, then the other ancestors.
Yeah, I'm curious too. I wonder, I mean, I think of the people gathered here today, we're all convinced friends. Is that true? That this is something in terms of especially the Quaker community right now, this is, I guess what I'm curious what sort of Tobin was saying, that a group when it's persecuted sort of I feel like that maybe was what happened to Quakerism during Quietism, like it drew in when it was being persecuted, and then that sort of lineage and continuity and making sure you marry and stay in the community became very important to them. And I guess nowadays we're not particularly persecuted, and we also don't really have a very, or there is not a great deal of intergenerational continuity, it seems like, in Quakerism at the moment, which I guess, I'm curious I feel like, are we just like a totally different beast now, I guess, as Quakers, because we just sort of are groups of people who come together around these ideas, as opposed to like a community that extends through like lineage and generation?
It's a little different among conservative friends and Eastern friends, where there's more family ties, let's say. Yeah. But I think that's well taken. I think largely we are not a community of physical relationship as so much as a community of faith and ideology.
And I think about my grandchildren, who now are mixed up completely, both in terms of
That's
their
what all
cultural
grandparents say.
Background. On the other hand, both sides of the family, the grandparents are New Yorkers, who grew up very close to each other. And, you know, so it's really interesting to think about. But, you know, my daughter-in-law comes from a Eastern Catholic family, a liberal Eastern Catholic family. But she actually grew up in Hawaii. So she's got some of that in her. And then, you know, my son comes from a Quaker family, which came from a Jewish family. So, and then added the Texan in Terry when he was 5 years old, basically. So Terry's been around since he's 5 years old. So, you know, where's the tradition there? But also, you know, I think my son has less of the Jewish tradition than his blood is all that. But it's just sort of, you know, he's been raised a Quaker. So is he a birthright Quaker? His parents were Quakers when he was born, or almost. He was 2 weeks old when my first husband became a member of the meeting. So I think that we're really in that state of being, and I'm not sure it's a bad one.
I think that the extent to which maybe we do it more now in modern times, you know, in the last 2 or 3 generations with life changing so rapidly. But I think it's always been true that to some extent, people assume traditions. You know, they take them on and they can decide. Every generation decides what those traditions are, you know, and we for instance, as friends, all convinced friends, all sitting here, can decide about our Quaker quote unquote forebears, you know, and what we want. There's a book, I'll just make reference to it, by Eric Hobsbawm, the late famous British Marxist historian, called The Invention of Tradition. And basically, he points out that the modern national image that the Welsh, the Scots, and others have of each other was largely invented in the 17 and even 1800s. And even a lot of the traditions we think of as, you know, just really, really Scottish, for instance, are like for instance, the kilt was a Quaker industrialist who had textile factories in Scotland, was distressed that men were getting caught in the machinery, but because they wore these long robes. So he invented this thing, you know, for them to wear that was shorter. Just an example, I guess, of how tradition is, you know, we think of it as this thing stretching way, 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 way back, but who knows, you know? After all, we only know up to the time we were, you know, from the time we were born, you know, what we think of as the past.
Well, it kept them from being killed, at least.
Oh. Very, very nice, very nice.
I think that might be a fitting end for today's forum.
Oh, it's scary though. Is it a requirement that you be able to fund in order to be a member of the
It's part of our tradition.
Great. Well, anyway, thank you so much, friends, for participating in this. It was very enlightening to me. Great. Yeah, I will see you guys in meeting for worship in just a few minutes.
Okay.